Guillermo del Toro is a filmmaker that mostly everybody has a dream project they wished he would make. He's also a filmmaker with an entire Wikipedia page dedicated to all the projects that were unrealized. It's kind of insane that he struggled so much throughout his time to get projects off the ground despite nearly everything he's touched turning to gold. But for what we do have, he has a solid catalogue. His batting average is insane, and he has some inarguable classics. Pan's Labyrinth, The Devil's Backbone, Kronos, The Shape of Water, and even most recently with Pinocchio. I'm also a big fan of Blade 2 personally. But not often talked about is his comic book movie duology of Hellboy. Now, though the second is considered to be the better film on average, I'm a personal fan of the first. I have a deep connection with this movie, and I think it's a perfect comic book movie. Not a perfect movie, it has its flaws, but in ways of being a comic book adaptation, it's a masterpiece. I mean, for starters, this came out in 2004, so just after Spider-Man and X-Men, and the comic book movie superhero genre was starting to blow up. I mean, this year alone had Spider-Man 2, Catwoman, Blade Trinity, The Incredibles, and of course, Hellboy. And in the current world of shared universes and intertwined narratives, it's nice to go and watch an isolated comic book movie that has no wider implications. And when you read a Hellboy comic, thinking about an adaptation of that work is kind of impossible. It's impossible because so much of it relies on that beautifully dark and gothic art style of Mike Mignola. But when you throw out the name Guillermo del Toro, things start making sense. For a start, his style is inherently gothic and horror without being terrifying. He can craft fun and interesting worlds that all ages can enjoy without being terror-stricken. Obviously, he changes that from project to project depending on what degree of horror he's aiming for, but he's so good at finding that balance and nuance which is essential for bringing the character and world of Hellboy to life. I mean, just look at the sets and character designs. The costuming and wardrobe is timeless for these main characters. Abe and Hellboy look good even 19 years later, and you cannot say the same for many of the superhero flicks that came out around this time. This came out a year before Fantastic Four, which, though I do love, has aged significantly worse, and you cannot deny that. This is made even more impressive because say something like Spider-Man 2 that came out the same year. The weirdest thing in that movie is a scientist with mechanical arms. It's not difficult to make that design look good in 2004 and last. Same for, say, Batman Begins, which came out a year later. It's not difficult to make that character look good in that time and make the design last. However, in Hellboy, they have to make a red demon with a stone arm look good, and they do. They gotta make this humanoid amphibious man look good, and they do. And both of the designs still look good to this day. But then they gotta throw in fantastic creature designs for the monsters, and the practical costuming they put together is insane. Also, this character was created by Del Toro himself for this movie, and you wouldn't even be able to tell this wasn't pulled straight from the source material because it just works its way into the narrative so well and fits the aesthetic. And it doesn't just fit the aesthetic visually, it fits the aesthetic conceptually. But this is why this film works so well as a comic book movie. It isn't a direct adaptation of the stories, or even the relationships between characters, or even characters themselves. See, so many of these films, and honestly the 2019 Hellboy effort, are so wrapped up in translating the source material that they forget to adapt it. See, a comic book adaptation should never be one for one, because they're different mediums, they require different treatments. The 2019 film was so caught up in doing the comics justice that they forgot to really make a movie. Guillermo del Toro understands that bringing something to the big screen involves not just taking the source material and putting it up there, but changing it to make it work for that medium. One of the most vital changes that Guillermo makes is changing Hellboy from a sort of anti-hero to a bona fide superhero. Now, part of the background discussion of Hellboy is whether he's a hero, anti-hero, or whatever kind of label, but here there is no question about it, he's a good guy. But he also has a lot of character. He isn't stripped of his darkness. I mean, he's a demon for God's sake, but his motivations and morals are almost never in question by the audience. And that would be the same for Batman or Superman. He's given the same moral treatment. But Hellboy still maintains his fun personality, but not in the way he's laughy or jokey, but in the way he's sarcastic, charismatic, kind of an arsehole, but watchable. And all these things were inherited from the source material. Del Toro took what works and changed what might not, and that was one of his more genius ideas to solidify the goodness of Hellboy. He even saves a litter of kittens. His destiny is to bring about the apocalypse, and yet we are so certain in his ethical standpoint that we don't doubt for a second where his heart is going to take him eventually. And I know a lot of people cry about it not being an entirely faithful adaptation, but I think those people need to get a grip. Because neither is Guardians of the Galaxy, or even the first Iron Man in the way that that film is good and the comics that preceded it were shite. Plus, Mignola famously loves this movie and its sequel because they have the heart and soul of his work. You don't need to be a replicant of the work, you don't need to translate that work one for one, you just need to have its essence to do it justice. And the greatness doesn't stop at the art direction or the adaptation quality, it's in the filmmaking itself, in the veins. The pacing is phenomenal, it's a 2-hour movie that flies by like it's half an hour shorter, and that pacing is aided by Del Toro knowing when the story needs to slow down and have its character moments. Not even particularly character progression moments, but scenes of the characters just hanging out and doing stuff. It endears us towards them and lets us learn about them, but then he also knows when to kick in the action and at what pace to set each action sequence out, which are all entirely unique to each other. The film ends exactly where it needs to. It doesn't linger and doesn't care about giving you the epilogue. It gives you the story it intends to tell you and then leaves you. And on top of all of that, the story elements are perfect. It gives us a surrogate character in John Myers that we can follow on our journey to learn about this world and its characters whilst not feeling out of our depth as an audience member because we're not entirely alienated from the entire character list. We have someone to attach ourselves to. It isn't afraid to get dark or use horror imagery. It toes between the epic and fun and the horrific and terrifying. Main characters die. The creature designs are creepy enough to be intimidating but not scary enough your kids will get nightmares, and the third act all but confirms to me that Del Toro is the one to handle some Lovecraft because that shit would be great. And that point speaks to the overall point I'm trying to make. This film is so beautifully unique. There is really nothing like it, and again, in a world of multiverses and shared universes and dozens of superhero movies every year, most of them these days blend together so easily, and they shouldn't. Because any comic book fan will tell you every hero has their own feel and aesthetic, even individual arcs have entirely different feelings, but the movies don't reflect that. But this is a problem when dealing with Marvel or DC because they have these gargantuan companies monitoring the use of these characters so closely because they're all supposed to be in the shared universe that needs to work and have the same audience. But Hellboy is a Dark Horse comic. It's independent and individual, and the movies are allowed to reflect that because they're in their own little vacuum. And what's crazy is this film cost $66 million to make roughly, and it looks far better than basically every superhero film released this year with their sizable budgets. Because making something like this isn't about the budget, it isn't about getting a star-studded cast to sell the movie, it's about the vision and the filmmaker and the crew and casting the best people for the job. I mean, Ron Perlman as Hellboy is a top 5 comic book movie casting decision of all time in my opinion. And all of this put together I think makes for what I believe is a wonderfully cast, gorgeously crafted and masterfully directed, perfect comic book movie. But that's just me. What do you think? Have you seen Hellboy? If so, let me know what you think about it. Let me know what you think about this video. I read every single comment and reply to as many as possible, and whether it's a perfect comic book movie adaptation from Guillermo del Toro or not, as always, keep watching movies.